See, that's a good follow-up. Good afternoon, and then there we go. Everybody's with us now. Welcome to the results event with Governor Charlie Baker and Mr. Steve Kadish. My name's Erwin Morris. I'm the Executive Director of the School of Public and International Affairs. We're the home for the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, and we've got programs in leadership in the public sector, public safety leadership, and we have a master's in international studies. So a little advertisement for SPIA. We'll begin with a conversation focused on Governor Baker and Steve's new book, Results, Getting Beyond Politics to Get Important Work Done. Mr. McKinley Wooten will be our moderator. Appreciate that. And then following discussion, we'll have time for question and answer. And then Steve and the governor will be available for book signing immediately after the close of the event. Appreciate you all being here today. Now to introduce the participants, I'll turn the floor over to the new Executive Director of the Institute for Emerging Issues, Sarah Langerhall. Sarah.
All right, well, welcome everyone. So glad to have you with us this afternoon. It's the Monday after spring break. It's the first day of spring break or spring. So good to see so many familiar faces. And for those of you who are new, the new faces in the room, just a little bit about us. So the Institute for Emerging Issues is a public policy organization here at NC State that focuses the state's attention on finding solutions to our most common emerging critical policy issues. As a nonpartisan connector, we bring North Carolinians together across sectors, regions, and perspectives to achieve our vision of a North Carolina where people connect and collaborate to build a vibrant and prosperous future for all. IEI is in our 21st year serving North Carolina, and through our signature event, the Emerging Issues Forum, which precedes us by a couple decades, the first Emerging Issues Forum was held in 1986 on the topic of how we can remain competitive in an increasingly global economy. And since then, we've covered topics in health, education, the built and natural environment, and economic development. Our most recent forum focused on growing the state's workforce by putting the needs of workers first. In addition to our Emerging Issues Forums, we also have several short and longer term initiatives that we currently are involved with to support communities across the state. We are connecting with nonprofits to build their capacity to increase educational attainment in their communities. We are supporting regional teams of workforce developers, economic developers, higher education leaders, and others to work on efforts that remove barriers for underrepresented individuals to connect to good jobs. We are helping all 100 counties in our state create more digitally inclusive communities where everyone has access and is able to use affordable internet, a device, and the digital skills to be able to use it to support health and opportunity. And we are strengthening networks, particularly in rural communities, by building the capacity of faith leaders and other community connectors to collaborate on key emerging issues. We are grateful for the opportunity to share a little bit more about our work with you and have you all join us here today for this important conversation. As a nonpartisan connector, we know how vital it is to work across our differences to develop meaningful solutions to our most critical challenges. And Governor Charlie Baker, a Republican, and Steve Kadish, a Democrat, are a shining example of the public good that can happen when we work together to achieve results. So you've got more information with their bio on the handout at your desk, but let me go ahead and take a minute to welcome our guests to the stage. Moderating today's session, I'm so excited that we've got McKinley Wooten Jr., who joined the Department of Revenue in April 2021 in the role of Assistant Secretary for Tax Research and Equity. He has over 30 years of state government service and began his public service career working as a civil magistrate in Wake County, and he has spent his early professional years representing citizens with disabilities at the Governor's Advocacy Council for Persons with Disabilities. He later joined the NC Department of Justice as an Assistant Attorney General, where he spent several years representing the NC Division of Child Development at NCDHHS. He serves on the board of directors for the State Employees Credit Union, the SECU Foundation, the North Carolina Museum of History, the UNC School of Government Foundation, the Alexander YMCA Advisory Board, and he serves as Minister of Music and Fine Arts at Pleasant Grove Baptist Church in Wendell, North Carolina. Thank you so much for being here to moderate today's session. I'm also pleased to introduce our distinguished guests who have traveled all the way here to North Carolina. We've got Governor Charlie Baker, who served 8 years as the governor of Massachusetts from 2015 to 2023, where he focused on moving Massachusetts forward through bipartisan, results-driven leadership. Governor Baker made historic investments in K-12 education, increased support for vocational and technical schools, and expanded early college opportunities for high school students. He prioritized fighting the COVID-19 pandemic and heroin epidemic, climate crisis, and led Massachusetts through the COVID-19 pandemic, Prior to his election, Governor Baker served as the CEO of Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare and served twice as Commonwealth of Massachusetts Cabinet Secretary, leading the Executive Office of Health and Human Services and the Executive Office of Administration and Finance. As of March 1st, so just very recently, Governor Baker is the current president of the NCAA. We also have with us Steve Kadish, who served as former Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker's first chief of staff, where his particular focus was tackling the most urgent policy and operational problems and building the organizational capacity to do so. He recently stepped down after 5 years as a senior research fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Tubman Center for State and Local Government. Steve has held numerous senior leadership positions in both higher education and in healthcare, including Northeastern University, Dartmouth College, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, and Brigham and Women's Hospital. He served as Massachusetts Undersecretary for Health and Human Services, Massachusetts Assistant Secretary for Administration and Finance, and Assistant Commissioner for Operations at the Massachusetts Division of Medical Assistance. He has also worked as an advisor consultant to the World Bank and the World Health Organization. And that's a lot. They are very distinguished I'm tired now from saying all of those great things that they've done. But once again, we're so glad that you all could be here, and we look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for being here today. And I have to thank these gentlemen for what is one of my favorite books. And I took time, even in the midst of a lot of basketball watching, to make sure that I got through it, because I told Steve as we were talking a few minutes ago that what you have here is probably one of the most relevant works for those of us who are in and around state government or local government, and those who are coming behind us. That's really important to me at this point, that we're creating something for the next generation to take over. So I'll jump into these questions, and I will say from the onset, if I don't get through all of them, if we come up with some salient points that we need to stay on for a while, we'll do that. But we'll also keep time for some questions from the audience at the end. Let's start with you, Governor Baker. You have worked in both the public and the private sector, and as we heard in the introduction that Sarah gave, talk a little bit about the biggest misperception that folks in the private sector have about public sector leadership and being a government executive.
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here, and I want to say special thanks to Tony Brown, who I just said to somebody earlier that Tony and I sort of grew up together. We worked the same organization after we got out of grad school, and even spent a little time throwing each other's kids up in the air when they were very small. But I really appreciate the chance to be with you, and I especially appreciate the chance to be with people who are in the space, whether they're practitioners or educators or both. This book was basically written for you. I think, and part of it has to do with the question McKinley brought up, which is this whole issue about the difference in sort of perception and reality that's out there generally. I've worked in the private sector, so has Steve. We both worked in the public sector. There are a lot of misconceptions that both have about each other. But I think the biggest misconception the private sector has about the public sector is the distributed decision-making model that you live in the public sector. There's an old saying in almost every strategy class I've ever taken that structure follows strategy. In the private sector, you can sort of decide what your strategy is going to be, and then you can create a structure to go get it. And in the public sector, you can create what you think is the right strategy, and then you have to sell it to a whole bunch of other entities that have every bit as much of a role to play in both how much money you're going to spend, where you're going to spend it, and how you're going to be organized and how you're going to be structured. And they may look at what you want to do and say, nah. And so you're constantly going to be debating strategy and structure in the public sector. It never stops. It's always happening. And you have to get comfortable in the public sector with this idea that you're not going to be able to make a decision that says, I think this is the right strategy. I think this is the right structure. Let's go. What will happen most of the time is you may get some permission to chase something directionally, but the likelihood you're actually going to get the structure that you actually believe you need to execute on that strategy is going to be enormously challenging to pull off. And so one of the things you need is patience, and the other thing you need is a willingness to recognize and understand that the world is not perfect, and a lot of other people in this process get to make decisions that are really important with respect to what you think the right thing to do is, and then how you're going to do it the right way. And to be willing to sort of quote unquote make the best of it, given that you're playing in a democracy, and in a democracy, a lot of people have their hands on big decisions that matter. And I think most people in the private sector, just because in their world, you just say, we're going this way, and here's how we're going to organize ourselves, either get on the boat or don't. It doesn't work that way in government. Never has. Probably, well, it does in very authoritarian countries, I suppose. But in democracies, it doesn't work that way. And there are good and bad consequences to that, which I think a lot of people in the private sector either choose to ignore or don't understand or appreciate, having spent time in both.
Thank you. Steve, what do you think about that question?
I'll jump to it in a second.
Oh, sure.
But I want to say thanks, Sarah and,
Oh, sure.
and Erwin, for organizing this. And so I want to give you guys a round of applause. It's special for us to be here and to be with you guys. So just two quick things to add. And you folks who work in the public sector know this. So in Massachusetts, there are 42,000, 43,000
Plus or minus, executive branch.
Employees. There might be 200 that have the word policy in their title. The other 42,000 are about service and operations. And so much of what state and local, and I'd also say federal government is about, is the actual delivery of all kinds of services. And you guys who are in the business know that. The delivery of the services is incredibly nonpartisan. That folks don't care whether you're an R or a D or a green or an independent in terms of the delivery of services. They want those services, schools, parks, roads, public safety. But the noise that you hear, the media noise and so forth, is usually about the policy fights. And so what's important to remember when you're doing the public sector work is the delivery of the services and the operations, incredibly nonpartisan, and then there's all this noise.
Totally agree. Governor, let's talk a little bit about when you organized your cabinet. You organized your office in a unique way, and you brought Steve on as your chief of staff, someone you had worked with for decades. And talk a little bit about the 3 or 4 positions that you thought were important to fill as you started being the CEO of this government operations. Talk a little bit about how you went through filling those roles and the ones you thought were important. And as a secondary question, if you had to do it differently, had to do it again now, is there something you do differently in that organization?
Well, one of the main points in the book is that people are policy, and the people you put in key roles are probably going to have a lot to do with what happens next. And sometimes, you get a twofer where you can actually make a statement and get the right person in the job, which is what I say happened with him when I asked him to be chief of staff, because Steve, he didn't work on the campaign. He wasn't involved in it in any way. In fact, he voted in the Democratic primary. He didn't even vote in the Republican primary. And so there was a public message in that this was not going to be an administration that was built around the letter at the end of your name. This was going to be an administration built around whether or not you could help us get the work done. And the second thing I got by choosing Steve was I got an operator. Most people think of chiefs of staff and governor's offices as issue managers and disciplinarians, okay? And that's fine if that's the way you want to organize your office. What I wanted was somebody who would be really focused on the actual operation of state government. And I've known Steve a long time. I knew he would be terrific in that role. And I knew that things that would get started would get finished, which was important to me. I think the chief of staff is obviously one of the most important hires you make. Secretary of Administration and Finance and Secretary of Health and Human Services, those two jobs I had under previous administrations. A&F is sort of A&F is, everything goes through administration and finance. It's where your budget, your operating budget happens, your capital budget happens. They oversee HR, they oversee all of your purchasing. I mean, it's all the quasi-independent agencies we have, they chair most of them. I mean, it is for all intents and purposes the money job in terms of how state government operates. And it's really important you get somebody in that role who understands the policy in many cases has more to do with how much money you spend than any decision you make over here does. And number two, if they're really good at it, they can be incredibly powerful enablers of things people are trying to do in and around state and municipal government. It also has the primary relationship with local government in Massachusetts. The third one would be Secretary of Health and Human Services, because it's a monster. It's more than 50% of the state budget, and it involves, in many cases, some of the most critical programs we operate and finance to serve some of the most at-risk and vulnerable populations we have. Mary Lou Sutter is the person who we put into that job as a social worker. I've known her for a million years. If you want somebody in a foxhole to watch your back, you want Mary Lou. And she had done similar sorts of things, not quite on that scale, in and around other governments and in the private sector. And I used to joke all the time that when I interviewed her, I got to the end of the interview and I said, "It's nice to see you, Mary Lou. Thanks for coming in. We have a few other people to talk to and we'll get back to you." I had no plan B. I mean, it was either Mary Lou or I was going to leave the job open until I talked her into it. But she was the right person for that role, and she stayed all 8 years, which is pretty unusual in that role because it's a nightmare of a job, and in COVID it was even more so. And then the last one I would pick would be your chief legal counsel. That sounds kind of boring, but
I think it's brilliant.
Thank you. But you do need somebody in your office who's going to tell you when what you want to do is just wrong. You can't do that. And when you stamp your feet and you have a tantrum and you say, "But goddamn it, I'm the governor," they're going to say it's still wrong. And in Massachusetts, the chief legal counsel also, in addition to managing all the lawyers and all the legal issues and all the rest, they're also the process through which judicial nominees come before the governor and lieutenant governor before we send them over to the governor's council to either be approved or rejected. And that is a really important job in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, judges are appointed, they're not elected. And I take a lot of satisfaction in the fact that the bar in Massachusetts thinks we set a really high standard and a really non-political standard around how we handled those processes. And we ended up, I think because, I'm 66, I'm kind of right in the middle of the baby boom generation, just a whole ton of judges retired over our 8 years. And as a result, I'm the only governor other than John Hancock that's ever appointed all the members to the state Supreme Judicial Court. And we also, over the course of our 8 years, appointed probably more than half of the judiciary. And to have a lot of the folks who've been in it and who stand in front of it and who work for it say, geez, you know, that was a pretty apolitical process. You put a lot of really terrific people on the bench. That doesn't happen if you don't have a really great chief counsel who's paying a lot of attention to that.
Steve, I want you to jump in on this question about the people selection as well. But Governor, when you talked about, you know, when you're in a foxhole and you want the right people there with you, I think one of the challenges of governance today is that the idea that everybody in that foxhole has to think like you and have the same political affiliation as you for you all to get along and to be able to do the work in the foxhole. I think that's a part of the challenge that
was certainly not our problem.
Yeah.
Mary Lou, I think, is a Democrat. She might be registered as an independent, but she's a
she's an
Democrat.
I, yeah.
She's a Democrat.
Yeah.
but it didn't matter. That's the whole point. You didn't know it, you know, it
Our
didn't
chief
matter.
legal counsels actually were both Democrats too.
Yeah.
My mother was a Democrat. My dad's a Republican. They argued this stuff. It's in the book across our kitchen table the whole time I was growing up. It was high theater for most of my friends, and I never. The whole idea that, you know, the letter at the end of somebody's name actually was a defining characteristic, I just never bought it because I never saw it in my own house. And my parents were they were never arguing about ends. What they were usually debating was like means and how are you going to get there? And why do you think that's going to work? And don't you think you need to think about this? And blah, blah, blah. What about the cost of it? That was my father's line always. Thought it would end most conversations. But this whole idea that, and it is a huge problem. And, you know, you want to go down this rabbit hole, I'm happy to go there with you. This whole idea that somehow we have two teams and those teams don't actually work together somehow for the betterment of everybody else is a big problem because they should and they do.
And I think the people who need, and you talked about DHHS and the vulnerable population, those people need a government structure that does not break down at the top so you can't get to them, you know, what they need. Steve, let me let you jump in on that, selecting the right people.
Yeah, you know, and I'm going to say people and teams. One of the things that Governor Baker did immediately was set up meeting structures, which sounds boring, had the full governor's office reporting to him and lieutenant governor team, have the whole governor's office one team, have the cabinet working with the governor's office one team, and kept sacrosanct a daily meeting early with the gov's office, and whenever there was an important issue, the right people, the right secretaries, agency heads. How many cabinet meetings did you have over 8 years?
Every Friday from 10 to 12.
Yeah.
Could not miss it.
In person.
Until the pandemic, and then it was virtual.
But you had this sense, we've all had previous experiences, and you guys in the public sector have seen it as well, is where you have a breakdown sometimes between the gov and lieutenant gov. You can have a breakdown between the governor's office and various cabinet secretaries. It happens. And so
You should take a picture of everybody in this room. We know what North Carolina is like. And when you said that statement, to just be here and look around the
I
room.
hope I didn't take your breath away.
And then,
But
no, it's already been taken.
but besides the selection of individuals, it was this importance that we were going to be a team. We were going to work together, and the practice of working together. And so by the time COVID came, the various cabinet secretaries had already worked on things together. And so the idea of having to work together was well practiced. And I think that's one reason.
That's true for the
the
cities
team
and
did
towns
well.
too. We had really good relationships with our colleagues in municipal government. The Lieutenant Governor and I both came out of municipal government, and she visited all 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts during our first year in office. I got to about 200. And we gave everybody our phone numbers. So the people in our administration knew that if you got a call from a municipal official and you didn't call them back, they were going to call the governor or the lieutenant governor, and then the governor or lieutenant governor was going to call you and say, why didn't you call them back? And that would usually...
In a much nicer tone.
Not really. But the point here was, people can trust each other even if they don't agree all the time. And we worked really hard to create that notion that that this whole thing is going to be a team-based exercise, and people are going to have to trust each other. And we talked about a lot of stuff in those cabinet meetings that would have made for really interesting news. And there was never a leak. I mean, not one. I mean, you think about this.
Yeah.
8 years, probably over that period of time, it's a cabinet meeting every Friday, so do the math, along with an administration where 2 or 3 of the cabinet members served the whole time. We had 10. Most cases we had 2 maybe, and my point here is we had a lot of people in those roles, not one leak, not one in 8 years. And none of our conversations with any of our colleagues in local government ever leaked either. I mean, there was a lot of trust there. And when people trust each other, they'll say things and do things that they wouldn't normally do otherwise. And I'll give you a quick example that's not in the book. We had a really awful natural gas explosion, where basically the guys in Ohio, which is where the line originated in, just did something to jack up the pressure in the line that the guys and gals in Massachusetts didn't know about. And when it went through the line, eventually what happened, when it got to Massachusetts and it got to these 3 communities up in Merrimack Valley, and it happened at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which is probably the only break we got because most people weren't home. But, a ton of houses got set on fire. One poor kid died because a chimney fell on him when it fell off the house. A couple of other people got horribly hurt, but the big challenge, in addition to all that, was we now had 3 towns that basically had no heat and no hot water, and it was kind of the beginning of October, so it starts getting cold. And the mayor of Lawrence, which has never voted for a Republican, including me, but was a guy I knew and knew well. And the city managers of the other 2 communities that were hit were also people we knew well. So, it was a whole team effort, literally, from the moment we got started. And usually what happens then is everybody starts to figure out the angle to make sure that, they're CYA on whatever happens and whatever decisions we make so they don't get in trouble and can have somebody else to blame when something goes wrong. There was none of that. The whole thing was literally just, we have a job to do and a problem to solve. We have like thousands and thousands of homes that we got to relight, we got to fix and relight in like the next 40 days. And it was just full speed ahead. And that was because for 4 years, we'd been working on those relationships so that people knew that if we said we were going to do something, we would do it. If we said we couldn't, it was because we couldn't. And we went, arm in arm on the whole thing.
Awesome. Steve, I want to turn to you for a minute. We can see how much your book is tabbed. That is a teaching tool. And I appreciate the manner in which you all presented the information, that it does lend itself very well to academic presentation for public officials and students alike. We talked about people being important. In your results framework, people are policy is one of the staples there. You also highlight follow the facts, focus on how, and push for results. Can you talk to us a little bit about those components and why that approach has been different from what many of us have seen in government?
So those four key elements, the book is written so that the first part of the book talks about the results framework, people or policy, follow the facts, focus on how, focus on how, focus on how, push for results. And then the second part of the book are 4 case studies. One on the health connector, the implementation of Obamacare. The second is on transportation, the MBTA up in Massachusetts, the first few years. The third is on the Department of Children and Families. Every state has a child welfare department. And the fourth, and I think it's one of the only things that are still out there, is COVID, and it was published at the time when the sitting state executive who was responsible for COVID, wrote and we published the book. So the 4 examples talk about those 4 precepts. So we talked about the importance of people. The second, follow the facts, has 2 elements to it, but the purpose of follow the facts is to be really objective about what is the problem you're trying to solve. And by doing that is understanding what some of the intervention points could be for the resolution. So the 2 things that we now do, and we used to, I think, honestly, really focus on the first, data evidence. Both data geek people, very happy with spreadsheets, reading reports, that kind of stuff. So the first element of follow the facts is data evidence, the stuff you can read and analyze. But the second piece, I spend, and I know you do too, Governor, more and more time here, we call points of pain. And these are the stories of the individuals who are the recipients of the service and also the people who are providing the service. And these real life stories and anecdotes combined with the data evidence gives you a really good picture of the facts, the problems to focus on. Focus on how, if there's an element to this book, which we did right from the very beginning of the administration with the rest of the team, it's to help describe and support the importance of having a method of taking an idea to delivery. And the 2 parts of focus on how are what to do and how to do it. What to do it is typically where I think a lot of us have seen things stop. The announcement, the budget, a piece of legislation, an ordinance, a report, a set of recommendations, the what, the promise of what should be done in order to resolve the problem. But that is, I don't even know if it's half the issue. The how to do it is the transition from the ideas, the concepts in the what to the actual delivery. And that's where over the 3 decades, we have first met the governor on projects and introducing him to project management and a series of methods. And so the book talks about some tips and tools and methods and the importance of having a method, focusing on how, because that's where the majority of attention needs to go. And then finally, push for results. There's this quote we like from John Wooden, pretty apropos
apt,
right
actually,
now,
yeah.
right? UCLA basketball coach, 60s, 70s. Don't mistake activity for achievement. So your texts, your emails, your meetings, your important, but that isn't the same as actually getting things done. So we measure results, and this guy is insistent on it, by measuring actual performance metrics or the actual, I'll say green, yellow, red status of actual progress on projects. And so you can have the people, the facts, the focus on how, but at the end of the day, you're measuring what those results are. And the thing that is really hard to do in any entity, public or private, but is super hard to do in the public sector, is to admit when what you have proposed to do and are implementing it isn't working the way you want to do it. And so our little mantra is measure, right? Measure the performance, measure the project status, evaluate, understand what's working and what's not, and then adjust. And so that adjustment could be quiet in the room, or sometimes the adjustment has to be the governor getting up there and saying to the media, we're making a change. And the media is all over that. And then repeat that cycle. So measuring, evaluating, adjusting, repeat. And so that in whatever, 3 minutes is the first part of the book. So
Very good. Governor, you want to add anything to that?
The only thing I would add is this whole issue about points of pain. We didn't put a story in here about the registry, but we could have. The lines there were just insane when we took office. And-
registry of motor vehicles.
Yeah, registry of motor vehicles. And
We've seen a few of those.
okay, and they had huge crowds sitting in there reading Moby Dick, waiting to get called on, and yet they said they had a 30-minute wait. Like, how can this be? And it turns out that the way they measured the wait started when you got this ticket, but you didn't get the ticket until you got through 2 other lines. And so point number 1 is if you're just looking at the metrics, say you only have a 30-minute wait. What's the problem? The problem is the points of pain pretty clearly indicated that it wasn't a 30-minute wait. And this was annoying, not just for the person who's losing a whole day to try to get a simple transaction done. Can you imagine working the counter there and knowing that every single person who's going to come up in front of you is going to be spitting bullets by the time they get there, and so mad they can hardly see straight, and you're going to be the one who's going to have to absorb all of that anger when they show up. So it's a horrible thing for the person who's working there and a horrible thing for the person who's trying to get their transaction done. So we all went out and we just stood in the registries and watched them for a while. And they ran them the way you would expect, which is the same way we do banks and airports, right? One line, you get in your one line, and then you go to the counter when the next one becomes available. Now, the problem with this is that this isn't like checking into an airline or doing a simple transaction at a bank. It's dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of different kinds of transactions, some of which are really complicated and some of which you need to show up at the counter with all kinds of stuff. So we said, okay, this process, here's our problem. There's a process problem. It's not that we don't have enough people behind the counters. It's not that we're not open enough hours. It's not that enough stuff isn't online, although COVID got a lot more stuff online. It's we have a process problem. And so what we did is we stole an idea from Apple. And when you showed up at one of our registries, we did this as a demo first before we sort of rolled it out all over the place to get the kinks out. But when you'd show up, somebody'd be standing there with kind of the equivalent of a clipboard, an electronic clipboard, and would say, how can I help you? And you'd say, well, I have 3 license plates from my daughter in Kentucky and my son in Connecticut and my uncle from Ohio, and they're all coming here, they're moving here to go to school, and I need to get Massachusetts plates for all of them. And then that person would say, well, do you have this, 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 and this? And you, of course, would say, no, you didn't. You would send that, you would say, well, right over there, you can access those forms, and you can fill them out on that machine, and then print them out and come back when you're done, okay? So now, and if you show up and you say, I'm getting my driver's license renewed, and you say, do you have this, this, and this? And you say, yes, you say, go right there. And so directing traffic as people were coming in the door and giving people places to go where they could get whatever documents they needed to be fully ready to be served when they went to the counter, completely changed everything. So much so that we literally had a conversation about whether or not we needed to rebid all of our space because we had nothing but empty chairs as far as the eye could see. And all these people were getting in and getting out. And guess who the happiest people of all were? The people who worked there, who all of a sudden had happy people who were surprised by how fast their problem got solved when they showed up. And in Massachusetts, this is 3 million transactions a year. So state government has 3 million opportunities to make a positive or a negative impression on someone. And using the framework here, right, around following the facts, points of pain, and pushing for results, we basically made everybody happy. And And that's not the only story that reads like that. And that one, we didn't even think that one was good enough to get in the book. So there really is something to this method. It's not just about sort of geeking out and thinking about this stuff differently. You actually have a chance to make people who work in the public sector proud and happy of the work they do, and make people who need the public sector to perform to be happy too. And part of this book is about rebuilding some of that lost faith in the public sector's ability to perform, which for both of us is deeply important.
So one, lot of positive stories, but one funny story. A professor at the Harvard Kennedy School that we both know was going to get his daughter's license, something or other. So he took all his papers that needed to be graded because he knew it was going to take a long time, and so he sits down at the registry with, when he starts to like spread out all of his papers, and his daughter comes back in like 8 minutes, and he's like aghast, and he's like, "What's the matter?" And he said, "Nothing, Dad. I've got my license." And so I thought that was just a sweet story because we're at a school where that probably you guys.
No
can
more
relate.
grading papers.
I was going to
Yeah.
say, but you're in a state with the really long DMV lines, and for all folks that want to go to Massachusetts, it's very cold to keep from going to DMV.
It's now appointment only.
Oh, is it?
And we have senior days on Thursday and Friday mornings.
Well, as you know, so North Carolina, I was really joking, DMV commissioner, about the DMV lines, but they are long. This is a very different state than Massachusetts and any other state you go to. Talk a little bit, how can a framework like this be successful outside of Massachusetts, where the politics is different, the issues are different? What tips would you give to other states, including this one, on how this framework can be useful?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing I would say is that this really isn't a partisan effort, I don't think. I mean, we all have people to serve and problems to solve. As Steve said, we're either delivering a service or providing some kind of support somewhere. And I think you can use the framework in a lot of different environments to actually improve the quality of what you're up to. I would say that one of the things that was particularly important to us, and I continue to believe this, is that for most people, the provision of a lot of these services is not a partisan issue. And I gave a talk, it's actually a lecture, so I wrote it down, at the Kennedy School. It's called the Godkin Lecture. It gets given every year. I gave it a week before the midterms, and I talked a lot about kind of the state of our national political dialogue. And to really shorthand the speech, my basic point was social media has made both edges really loud, really organized, really influential. The media pays too much attention to them. That's not where the American people are. And I'll just leave it at that. The basic point I tried to make was the vast majority of the people in America are center right and center left, and they're being ignored by everybody. And they're pissed. That's what they're pissed about, that they're being accused of being crazy right or crazy left, and they're neither. And they're looking for people in public life who aren't. And my conclusion was all of the extreme candidates are going to lose next Tuesday. And they did, just about all of them. And where they won, they ran miles behind the other candidates in the race who would be considered sort of middle of the road types. And this thing is basically, if people actually take this and they use it to improve the quality of the way they serve people and the way they serve their employees and their workers by virtue of doing that, a lot of people appreciate it. Now, if you listen to the crazy right or the crazy left in Massachusetts, you would swear it's the worst governor of all time. In fact, they said that about me. He's the worst governor of all time, all right? And yet, He left office with a 75% favorability rating, okay? And a stack of mail that came in for the next few months from people, just ordinary, regular people in Massachusetts, writing and saying, you know, how much they were going to miss the way we did business. And, you know, I think the way we did business was to listen to a lot of voices, and there were a lot of points of view around the table. I mean, one of the things I always say to people, and I'll probably try and say this to the kids when they come in after, the amount you grow in the public sector is amazing to me, because there are so many voices and so many points of view and so many life experiences and professional experiences. If you're actually paying attention, you will grow in ways you can't in other environments. It just won't, because there's so many different thoughts and ideas and way to see the world that come at you. And I love my time in the private sector. You get to pick your own team, you pick your own structure, you pick your own strategy, and boom, it's like rowing an 8-person crew with every single person pulling the oar in the same direction. You know, government's more like everybody gets an oar and they row it in whatever way they want, and the goal is just try and get the boat to move in the right direction. But the amount you learn and the amount you change and grow as a result is just so different and so special and so unique. And with that, though, comes the challenge of being able to sort of, you know, maintain your balance among a lot of the yelling and screaming. But that's not where most people are. It just isn't. And that's the thing people need to keep in mind.
Well, Steve highlighted, Governor, that you are one of the few and maybe only governor that was a sitting official during COVID and has had the opportunity to write about it, to reflect on it and write about it. With the great resignation, the great reshuffling, the mass exodus of workers, and the public sector wasn't exempt from that. Because of the significant role that the public sector plays in directing services, as we've talked about, how did you handle that? Because I'm sure Massachusetts was not exempt from the mass exodus for those of us that read, the governor in Virginia decided to call everybody back. And there were like 400 resignations from state government. Talk a little bit about how you dealt with the people part of that during COVID and the great resignation that we're all still dealing with.
So we adopted a hybrid work model because that was pretty consistent with what a lot of other people were doing. And that kind of became the way we were sort of working during big parts of the pandemic anyway. But we actually negotiated it out with the bargaining units. We have about 60 unions that work in the executive branch or represent workers in the executive branch. And we basically worked out this hybrid arrangement with them, which also changed the way we used our office space. I think by the time we get done implementing this thing, we'll probably save $20 or $30 million a year on rent. But this was one of our ways of sending a message to people that, you know, we were going to give them, if it made sense under certain circumstances, the ability to take advantage of some of what we'd learned about the nature and the process of work during the pandemic. We also came up with some ways for a lot of our customers to do a lot of things online that previously they had to come in and see somebody to do. And we got pretty aggressive about, you know, the standard way of just recruiting people. We'd already changed in a pretty significant way when we took office. I mean, when we took office, people used to just post jobs on the state's website and hope people responded, which doesn't work, not today. I mean, we're very aggressive about literally being in every single platform there is out there. And then if anybody calls, or sends an email, somebody's calling or reaching out immediately and saying, you know, let's talk, let's get on a Zoom, let's have a conversation and see if what we're up to is for you. We also put a lot of programming into self-help and development that got beyond. I mean, one of the things people do is they offer tuition reimbursement, that kind of stuff. but they make you get to a certain degree level to get to the next step in the organization. We said, if you take a class and this, and this, and you do well in all of them, you'll be eligible to get promoted. And I think one of the biggest mistakes we've made generally as an employer community is putting too much faith in the degree when what you really want is a skill set. So for example, we had a lot of people who were individual contributors, been around forever, graduated from high school, went to work for state government, worked in 14 different jobs in an agency, but never managed anybody, never got a BA, and therefore would never qualify to be a manager, even though they knew more about the way the business worked than just about anybody. So we said, we'll go take a finance class so you understand how an income statement and a balance sheet works. Take a course in organizational development so you understand kind of the nature of being the leader of a bunch of people. Take a class in communication and take a class in project management. And if you take all 4 of those classes, we'll consider you qualified to go ahead and take one of those management jobs. And I think one of the things that people aren't doing is rethinking the way they chase talent and the way they retain talent as being the place to start. I mean, people think, the $5,000 bonus or this or whatever, fine, but that's not going to be the thing. If it still takes you 2 weeks to call somebody back, they're already going to be working for somebody else, or they're going to be insulted that it took you 2 weeks. And if you're still going to make them come to an empty office, there are a lot of things we can all do. And our HR people are actually part of a big HR network. It's not my government anymore. The Commonwealth's HR people are part of a big HR network. And they talk all the time about what people are doing to both retain. Because the retention issue is every bit as important these days as the recruitment issue. And they're doing a lot of things that I think are consistent with that. But they have some real challenges. I'll give you one of the biggest ones, which I certainly didn't see coming until it hit us. All of the ways you can drive and make a living now without having to deal with unruly passengers has made it tough to recruit bus drivers. And we still have, the Commonwealth still has big plans for buses. We think there's 1 million. We've replaced almost the entire fleet. The whole thing was in much better shape. It's a much better ride. But a lot of the folks who used to drive buses are now driving for Uber Eats and Grubhub and Amazon. And some of them will get back because that's a tough way to make a living. But the big thing we heard when we talked to them about it, about why people didn't want to drive a bus or drive something else was, delivering packages, no one's going to yell at you, throw a quarter at you, chew you out for whatever. And I think that creates a whole new set of challenges that people have to take seriously.
Okay, I'm at the end of my time for questions. I want to pause, though. We wanted to, first of all, let's thank these gentlemen for the prepared questions. But we want to spend some time and turn to the audience, and thank you all for agreeing to accept questions from the audience off the cuff like that. So we would open the, see something you want to say?
Except from Tony.
Except from Tony. I think, are they going to bring up, they're going to bring, yeah, there'll be a roaming mic here in a minute. Just, if you would, just raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. Let's start with the young man back there in the back. I think I saw his hand first.
Governor Baker, I'm Evan Shine. I'm actually from Massachusetts. My mom was the open space coordinator for the city of Newton for 20 years.
No kidding.
Yeah, and I ended up I'm in North Carolina. I'm good, man.
It's for the stream.
Oh, man. All right. Do I have to say that again? Anyway, I'll just go right. Actually, it's just a thumb test of a question. Can you comment on publicly traded companies from the state of Massachusetts?
Can I comment on what?
Publicly traded companies from the state of Massachusetts? Or should I get you after?
You should probably ask me after, because I'm not sure I'll know very much about whoever it is.
Well, it's Ginkgo Bioworks, right? And I guess
I certainly know who they are, yeah.
totally. So maybe I'll get you after.
Okay.
But I guess I feel like one of my biggest grievances, and this is not an airing of grievances or anything like that. I remember trying to get a job at Ginkgo Bioworks, pretty hardcore for years. It's a very competitive environment up in the state of Massachusetts, right? I actually had to go back to graduate school, right? And, learn a whole new skill set. And I guess my biggest thing is, these companies should really be, I guess, innovating in the way that they do recruit and retain talent, and not just kind of like, I don't know, listen to people who tell them to hire certain people. Oh, no, the question was if you can comment on publicly traded companies or not. I think Ginkgo's trading about at $1 a day,
I
so.
will be happy to talk to you about Ginkgo.
Thank the young lady right there. Yep. Yes, ma'am.
So as someone who finds themselves comfortably in the center, not on either edge, how do we participate in this conversation and think about finding the facts when there's so much contrary information out there about what the facts really are without becoming part of the edge?
So, my view on that one is try and find sort of writers and public figures who aren't trying to play this game, right? There are a bunch of people I follow, and there are a bunch of people I followed all the way through the pandemic, who I viewed as pretty sober, pretty serious, and weren't playing to anybody's edge. And I think one of the, and they don't obviously get the same amplification that a lot of the people who play on the edge get, but they're there. And I learn a lot from those folks. And those are, one of the, people can curate, the social media platforms will certainly curate your news for you once they figure out what gets your heart rate up. But you can also curate your own information sources in a way that you never could before to get the folks who you think actually are trying to think through things and listen to more than one voice and aren't just trying to win a street fight. And that would be my recommendation. And there are people who run for office like that. They don't get any attention, right? But they're out there.
And we've got an election coming up. So I think it's a good time for us to start asking the hard questions of folks who intend to run. Yes, ma'am.
I had a question because I agree with you about the people that most people are centrist, but you had said in the beginning, like, you selected your people and you selected Democrats, even though you obviously were Republican, but there's a lot of pressure after you're elected wasn't there pressure from the Republican Party to choose or appoint people or select people that were from your party? So how do you get to be, because that's really the difference. And how do you make sure that other people following like yourself then do that, choose these bipartisan people? Like you had Mary Lou picked.
Yeah, so one of the things I talk about in the Godkin lecture, not to come back to that, is that for a very long time in the United States, if you look at the annual Gallup polling on political registrations, there's like a third Democrat, a third independent, and a third Republican. For the last 20 or 30 years, the number of people who are unenrolled has been going like this, and the number of people who are registered as Democrats and as Republicans are going like this. People are turning away, and as those parties, by the way, as people turn away because they don't like this whole idea that I have to agree with you on everything, parties get more and more isolated and more edgy because the centrists are unenrolling. In Massachusetts, and we're soon going to be at 50% of our country is going to be unenrolled voters, okay? In Massachusetts, it's 60%, all right? So we already have an electorate, in my opinion, that is a lot more multifaceted and thinking for themselves than they get credit for, because the media continues to focus on what I would describe as the parties, okay? And I think one of the things that we did was we hired based on whether or not we thought you had the right attitude and the right ideas for the job. And there are a number of people, I'm not going to name names here, but there were a number of people we put into jobs who weren't Republicans and who the Republican sort of party base was like, I can't believe you put that person in that job. And then they started to do it. And they were like, oh my God, I can't believe you put that person in that job. They're doing great. And I think there's this assumption that whatever letter is there, that's defining. And, you know, on some issues it might be, but these days there are so many more people who are not defined by the letter. They're defined by the way they think and the way they absorb information and the way they make decisions.
And I just circle back to that is the majority of the work in state and local government is not political. It's the delivery of services. And that if you focus on the delivery of services and focus on those problems, and then you're looking for people who are good at that, there's gonna still be the heat from, you know, the farther right and left, but the average voter is going to say that's working. You know, this guy was one of the most popular governors in the country for 8 years running, and you would not know that by listening to certain media.
So I'm going to tell a story here. It'll take a couple minutes. I apologize, but it fits with this. When we took office, there were 53 communities in Western Mass that didn't have broadband. I mean, some people had satellites, but a lot of people would literally go to the local pizza store and steal off their Wi-Fi or go to the library or something like that. And that's like running water and heat and electricity these days. And when we asked people who were supposed to be overseeing this why it was the case, they said, well, they don't really want it. And so we did a whole people or policy thing. This one is in the book. And what we figured out was that they wanted it, but the offer that was being made by the state to make this work didn't work for most of them because it wasn't designed to think about and deal with the fact that in many of these communities, you'd have to put up more poles than you had people to actually solve their internet problem. So we gave them a menu. We hired a couple of guys and gals from Western Mass to work on this, first of all, who actually knew the people out there. And then we gave them a menu to choose from with a variety of options, the so-called, systemic choices, which you can do. And then we found a bunch of carriers and internet service providers and utilities who were willing to play with us. And then we created a team that literally banged away on this thing like maniacs for the next 5-6 years. And we managed to get 50-ish of the 53 lit before the end of the pandemic, about 40 of them lit by the time the pandemic began. Imagine going into the pandemic without having access to broadband. So they're pretty much all lit by the time we left office. And we had a big event in Western Mass to celebrate this, and like 400 people showed up, and they told the most amazing stories about the way this changed their life. And one of the stories was a guy who got up there and said he used to be a data computational analyst of some kind, and he worked for a big pharma company, life science company in San Francisco. He moved to Western Mass because his wife was from Western Mass. And he got a job working at UMass on a research project. So his wife gets breast cancer and she passes away. So he has to leave his job at UMass because he now has 2 daughters that he has to raise. And he does stuff where he can, but he doesn't have access to broadband. So he can't work from home and he can't do the computational stuff he used to do on a grand scale. He was doing smaller one-off projects and all the rest. And he said, I got into this whole thing about getting broadband in Western Mass, and I came to the conclusion after 5 years of it that my kids were going to graduate from high school before this happened. And he said, my oldest daughter is in high school. Her younger sister's a sophomore, so congratulations, you got it done before my kids graduated from high school. But the other thing you need to know is that because we got access to broadband a couple years ago, I got a job for another life science company that's headquartered in San Francisco, but has an office in Cambridge. I can work out of my house. I have a project team that has 12 people on it. And the problem we're trying to solve is a cure for breast cancer. Now, he told this story. There was not a dry eye in the place, but this incredibly dry, boring, yucky project about just pounding people into creating thousands of miles of cable and putting in 40,000 telephone poles into slate and just really tough stuff came alive in this one story this guy told about the way these things, to get back to Steve's point, they're not, they're not just stories here, they're stories here. And I walked out of there thinking, thank God we took on the incredibly boring project of pounding holes and putting up poles and laying cable so that some guy who lost his wife to breast cancer could work on a project to find a cure from his home and raise his daughters. And this shit is not partisan, a lot of it. It's just not. And what we have to do is get that and understand it. Because if you do, you have really special moments like that that never would have happened otherwise.
And one of the things I'll say from the book, the governor doesn't give himself enough credit for listening with his heart. The book is full of him listening to voters, to citizens, folks saying, this is what I need the government to do for me. That's not the only story. I mean, I think that's one of the great accomplishments of this book as well. If you are an official who works for the people, your job is to listen to the people and to work to resolve the issues that the people have. So, yes, sir.
First, I want to compliment you on a very unifying message about your book. Well done. I sense there's more outside of this room that should hear your message about really getting to work. My question is, if you look out across the country, do you see any states, red, blue, purple, that you feel are doing a particularly good job and at least doing a good number of the things you're referencing in the book?
So there's some Laura Kelly, who's the governor of Kansas, that's a very red state. She's a Democrat. She and I are both big Ted Lasso fans.
Me too.
Be curious, not judgmental. She's a great example of that. I mean, she's really figured out how to, and she got elected with almost 60% of the vote in a very tough state. Phil Scott in Vermont is a Republican in a very blue state. I think there are some states that are sort of always up for grabs. I think Doug Ducey actually in Arizona was pretty good at this in what was a complicated political environment, more complicated in some respects than mine. I was a huge fan of Rob Portman, who was in the US Senate. He's a Republican from Ohio. Just a really smart guy who was almost always connected with almost anything that got done in the Senate on a bipartisan basis. Todd Young, who's now, because the NCAA is headquartered in Indianapolis, he's a Republican, but he's one of those people who's always tangled up in almost any bipartisan anything that comes out of the Senate. I mean, they're there, but they don't generate the noise and the headlines that a lot of the other folks generate, because people gravitate toward that. In fact, what most people would probably tell you is most of the people I would come up with would be considered to be quote unquote boring. But in this day and age, boring's not a bad thing.
Can we make sure to get Tony?
Tony, you got something?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, okay.
Oh, sure.
Sarah, I apologize in advance.
Hey, thanks, guys. You may not have the background to know that this is the Hunt Library, really beloved Democratic governor.
4 terms, right?
Yeah, fantastic talent. He conceived of the Emerging Issues Institute. And Steve, this question's for you, because I know that most of anything great that Charlie gets credit for, you were the one behind it. But I think Sarah, it's something that you and I would really like to know is, Massachusetts was talking about the opioid addiction epidemic before anybody else. Talking about COVID before anybody else. Talking about gay rights way before anybody else. How did you pick, Steve, the emerging issues, the things that were just over the horizon that you then were able to pull a bipartisan group together to really, use a really methodical approach to, some really thorny, long-range looking issues. Thank you.
Tony, you are the most gracious man to have that question come to me because I'm going to start and then punt. But because my thing has been the opportunity to work with the governor on once the focus of the idea or the problem has been articulated, rural broadband, child welfare, the opioid issue, is to then run so hard using the results framework at tackling the issue. So the woman who asked the very first question about the noise everywhere, my response in a way is you have to drop down a level to focus on a particular issue and then spend the time focusing on the facts of that particular issue, both data evidence and points of pain, and then marshaling the people, the approach, and just being relentless about the results piece. So you are kind to say, how did that selection get done? And because I worked for him, it would be, okay, here are the 3 or 4 different things that we could choose to work on. Where, what do we run hard into? And I'll say this one other thing to give him another few seconds to think about this, but you can't do everything. And one of the things that's really important when tackling a problem, first it's which of the problems are you going to tackle, because you can't tackle them all. You just can't. And when people are, addressing 80 issues, not that much gets done in any one of them. You tackle 8 issues, a lot can get done. And then when you're focused on an issue, it really matters what you tackle first to get something done and to create the leverage moving forward. So it's more art in terms of, well, some of the issues come at you. The COVID, appeared. Other major problems appeared, and you have to deal with them. The opioid issue is one that was really clear, was important during the
14 campaign.
The 14 campaign. This would have been too big of a meeting, but in small coffees, governor would speak and somebody would come up to him afterwards and say, this is what's going on, this is what's going on. And from the beginning of that year to the end of that year, it was a topic in almost every single one of the coffees and small talks. But you're asking an important question, Tony. So I'm interpreting it as how do you tackle how do you choose which issue to tackle of all the problems, and then within a particular issue, where do you start? And I think so. That's my ops perspective on what you're asking. And with that,
So you're right, Tony, by the way. I sit on the shoulders of all the amazing people who have worked with me over the years, no question. But I really got to start with this whole issue about listening, okay? I mean, I heard the opioid thing loud and clear from people who were coming up to me. No one brought it up during the Q&A, the public Q&A. It was always like, I'd be standing around talking to people afterwards, taking selfies or whatever, and they'd still be standing around. And then eventually everybody would scatter, and then they would start telling me their stories. So I just started bringing it up as an issue just to see if anybody would raise their hand in the middle, giving them permission to raise their hand and talk about it. Still didn't do it, still came up to me afterwards. So then I came out of the healthcare space. So then I called up a bunch of my friends who work in ERs, and I said, what's going on with opioids? And they were like, it's a calamity. It's like a crisis. It's like unbelievable. Just a total disaster. And I would listen to this and I would say, I've known you for like 20 years. I'm running for governor. How come I haven't heard from you? So look, I'm just busy trying to boil the ocean here. I don't have time to talk to you, to reach out and talk to you about this. So That thing literally just found me. But sometimes it's, you talk to a whole bunch of people about the crisis in getting city kids through college because they bomb out in the first year because they can't make their way through all the remedial courses they have to take, and it's a different experience, and nobody in their family's ever gone to college before. So at that point, we said, well, instead of trying to solve the problem when they get to college, what if we actually let them start going to college while they're in high school so that they can actually take classes in a space they're familiar with, hopefully by someone they're familiar with, and get a lot of that remedial stuff done and out of the way and create confidence and momentum. And so we created this early college program, and we tried, this is a good example of the strategy structure thing. We could only get the legislature to give us a little bite on it because they thought the only people who would take advantage of this program were kids in the suburbs. I knew damn well who was going to take advantage of it, and I knew it was going to be kids in cities, and that's exactly what happened. And so over the course of 4 or 5 years, this program went from this big to this big, and like 75% of the kids who were going through the program were kids of color. 90% of them were coming out of city schools, and 100% of them were graduating from high school with more than a year's worth of college credits and a relationship with a local college already under their belt. And I sort of, I think it was the 2018 State of the State address, I brought like 20 kids from Lawrence, all of whom were Black and Hispanic, to the State House for my State of the State. And I said, 10 of these kids are going to Merrimack on a free ride. 10 of them are going to North Shore Community on a free ride next year, and then probably going to Merrimack after that, because they've already proven that they can do college work. They already have a relationship with the professors and the teachers there. And this program is now, there are urban schools in Massachusetts where 100% of the kids are graduating from high school with an associate's degree. They only got 2 years of college left, and they already have all kinds of relationships, and there's nothing. The graduation rate so far in this program from college in 4 years, not 6, is 80%. All right? I mean, this thing is a machine, and I really do hope that, I spent a lot of time talking to the next administration about you guys, and the legislature finally figured this out. And the last year, they gave us more money than we asked for on this one. So some of it's not just about listening, but it's being willing to think differently about how you're trying to solve the problem. Voc Tech schools, we started throwing money at those things my first year in office. And the reason we started throwing money at them was because I went to visit a couple of them, and there were employers scurrying around in the hallways trying to get kids out of the computer science program and the electricians program and the plumbing thing. And then I was like, holy shit, these are, so you need a few of these? Yeah, I hire every kid that comes out of that program, every single one. Well, what are they gonna make to start? Probably $30 an hour. I mean, you hear these things and it's like, oh my God. So we put $200 million into upgrading the gear and the equipment in our Voc Tech schools that added 10,000 seats to our Voc Tech schools. If you listen, and you gotta listen, okay? You can find where the corner is coming from, but you're not gonna find that. The one thing I would say is, I don't have Tony Brown's ability to look around the corner, right? Tony doesn't need somebody to tell him what's coming around the corner. I need the Tony Browns, I need those people to actually talk to me and tell me. But if they talk to me and they tell me, I will hear it, and I will figure out how to actually get there by the time other people are just starting to think about it. But it's totally a listening drill. If you're not listening, you need the power and the intelligence and the foresight of everyone you come in contact with to be able to see what's coming, unless you're one of those very special people who just sees it because you're kind of built that way. And the only way you're going to get that is if you're a good listener.
And the listen has to keep going after the campaign trail, in other words, which you did, which is not always the case. Do we have time for another question, Sarah? Okay, one more. Okay. Christine.
So speaking as a consultant from Western Mass, now currently working with Mass Health and with North Carolina.
Yeah.
So it's interesting seeing in your book the page.
Where are you from in Western Mass?
Westfield. Yep. So hearing these stories is very heartwarming. But it's great seeing in the book just, the page on consultants and working with consultants. Something that I'm curious about from your perspective, what is something that you both would want to see a consultant coming with to help state government, specifically in the healthcare space, but interested in hearing from a general service perspective?
I have thoughts, but go ahead.
I just got a whisper saying you can't do work without
Can't
them
do
now.
government without consultants.
And-
Can't do it.
And I think that's okay, because going back to the workforce issue, actually, and when I think about COVID, when we had to engage 2,000 people to do contact tracing, it wasn't through a typical hire. It was through this local nonprofit, Partners in Health, that we had both known, or when you had to increase the number of folks doing the 911 calls, or when you had to increase the staffing for the Department of Unemployment Insurance, and on. And
So just this whole thing about, the contract tracing thing, the reason we even knew about it or how to do it was because we were sitting on the phone talking to a guy at 10:30 at night in the driveway, in the car, on my way home, right? I mean, that was not an idea that we cooked up. That was an idea somebody else cooked up and we just ran with.
he was in
fact, two
the
or three-
driveway. I was in my at home.
Yeah. And my point I was trying to make is, I would say half the really cool things we came up with, and we came up with a bunch during the pandemic, came from someplace else, and we just heard it.
So, when you read the book, it sounds like you might have, but the Health Connector chapter is all about a relatively small administrative office whose function is completely dependent upon how major contractors, consultants worked together and delivered. And over and over again. So one of the things, I think that workforce might be the existential issue for public sector. And all of the things that Governor Baker mentioned in terms of the direct hiring are going to need to be done, and a lot of other stuff too, including how to creatively use and think about the work differently so that you're tapping into, the talent of contractors and consultants to do that. And there isn't an agency in state government. Some of the smaller local governments may not have the capacity, but I bet there's not an agency in state government in the United States that doesn't have an important relationship, a really important relationship with contractors. Being the public administrator, it is a very different relationship to have with any kind of outside partner than it is with usually your collective bargaining workforce and the managers. And you have to know that, appreciate it, and work hard as hell to make it all work as one team. But I see positives there.
I'll give you 3 projects. Every state in the country has to redetermine their mass health Medicaid population, all right? And they got to do it in a way that doesn't create chaos and havoc, right? We did this once before because the previous administration broke the connector and they just put everybody on mass health, whether they were qualified or not. So when we took office, we had to actually redetermine them because the federal government was saying, if you don't redetermine these people, we're going to want our $1 billion back. So we actually figured out how to do that. But they all have to do it now because the emergency is going to end in May. And Massachusetts, I think it's going to be fine because we've done it before. But I think a lot of other states, it's going to be an enormous challenge. The second thing I would say is everybody is going to have, the healthcare issues, I think, are every bit as pronounced around staffing as as they are in other sectors, because it's 24/7 and it's enormously complicated and it's really difficult work. And some staggering number of nurses left after the pandemic was over. I think it was the single biggest group of people who left who were over the age of 50. Wow. And the third one I would say is people are starting to do more and more things outside of the hospital, and in some cases even outside the doctor's office. There's a lot of technologies that have been developed to do this. The payment systems haven't really kept up with it, which is always a problem. But there's a big opportunity there over time if people can think creatively about alternative ways of doing that. And that will bring me to my final one, which is you can now get a Medicaid waiver to do a lot more healthcare and assisted living than you used to be able to do. And you can do it in senior housing. I mean, you can do it in a whole bunch of places. And I don't think most states have come close to taking advantage of that. And bringing those services in, you can keep people. I mean, if you do a straight PACE program, you can usually keep them in the community until they pass away. But there are a lot of other programs you can do at this point. There's sort of like group adult foster care things that states really haven't. We did a lot with that. A lot of other states haven't even scratched the surface on that stuff. And as the population continues to age, it's a giant opportunity. I mean, the baby boomers are all between 55 and 75, and their parents are all between, 70 and 90. I mean, it's a giant group of people who are going to need something other than live at home or be in a nursing home or a hospital. And there's a lot of the in-between that's been sort of built out, but it still has a long way to go.
Well, for fear that Sarah won't invite me back, I get to go home and eat some wings, some basketball wings. They have another session to do. So join me in thanking Governor Baker and Steve Kadish for being with us today. Thank you very much.